one first. And now on to YouTube.
I think, Jim, to your point relative to the fees on the slip, I think at some point in time, they're going to want to dredge harbor, which will be, they're going to want to dredge, and that's going to be very expensive. So if we allow them to put aside the funds, then when they come for the budget request to the BET or the city, it will be much less and much more palatable.
Yep. It's going to be extremely expensive to dredge the harbor. And and I think that there's only 3 yacht clubs that get charged the mooring fee. And, you know, they've suggested that we charge everybody $35 per boat. And they've made some recommendations to the Harbor Commission to possibly adopt that $35. And had shown a study that they did that they could use that money. They would get a considerably more money than they're getting today. Plus, they also recommend that the consultant that they have probably should be put out for bid, since it has been the same consultant for the last 10 or 15 years or something.
Yep. Okay.
Here's a question relative to charging. Maybe it can be, the boats get taxed. Maybe there could be an additional tax on top of that that goes to the Harbor Commission, and that way.
No, the boats do not get taxed.
Oh, okay.
They don't get taxed as personal property.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Thank you, Mr.
Tom, I know we're waiting for Henry, but who, and I don't see Lundy on yet. Who else are we waiting for thus far?
Dr. Estrella.
I don't know if Artie's coming, Artie Kasimis.
I'm not sure.
Oh, he is just asking for the link. I can get that for him.
Well, you know, to your point, Ann, you do have to pay a registration fee for your boat. And there is, which is about $60. I think it's a little bit higher as it gets larger. But there is another question as to whether some of the yacht clubs are bringing up the legality of the mooring fees, and because it says that they pay for setting the mooring, and the moorings are not set by the city. The city doesn't do anything. The Harbor Commission doesn't have anything to do with the placement of the moorings, nor do they do any service or inspection of the moorings. So the yacht clubs are kind of upset because they never see the Harbor Commission. They don't get anything out of it. You know, there really hasn't been any accumulation of funds to put away for dredging either. So, you know, we have to face the fact that dredging is going to be a ridiculously expensive project, which is going to have to be done at some point in time.
How expensive do you think it ends up being? Is it?
I don't want to even venture a guess. It's hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Okay, but it's not more than 5 million.
Depends on how much you're going to dredge too.
Yeah, depends on what you're dredging. Linda, welcome. We're just waiting for a couple more people, and then.
All right, Henry's in the waiting room, Ed. Once you kick it off, just if you could pass it to me for about a 30-second administrative update, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, absolutely. Welcome everybody to the BET budget review with a specific focus on the Board of Education. Thank you for your time. This is an extremely challenging budget year. We are crawling through everything and challenging everyone on everything. I would tell you, we're doing it in the spirit of thinking about all of our constituents in Norwalk, and making sure that we're all doing right for them. So if the questioning gets tough or gets very specific, please don't think it's anything personal at all. We're just trying to be as fiscally responsible as we can. Before we get into the review, Tom, you've got an administrative issue, and then we'll see if the mayor has any opening remarks.
Yeah, thank you. As opposed to the regular BET meetings, which are set up as webinars, this is set up as a meeting. As such, there's no distinction between participants and panelists. So I would kindly ask that those of you who are not panelists remain unmuted, not unmuted, but remain on mute function. This is not a public hearing. The public hearing is next Wednesday at 6:30. So this is not an opportunity to provide feedback to the BET. This is similar to the department meetings we've held over the last 2 weeks, where department heads and division chiefs come and defend their budget requests. So with that, I think we can get started. Mr. Mayor, would you like to say anything?
Thank you, Mr. Ellis. No, I just want to, again, like I did the other night, thank the BET for their hard work. You know, we're taking a deeper dive this year, going deeper into the budgets, because we recognize exactly how difficult and challenging this year is. We're looking at virtually every line item from every department and asking questions, even when the line item might be $1,200 or $2,000. We're asking questions about those line items and see where there might be some savings. So again, I know, as Mr. Abrams said, sometimes department heads might feel that it's being personal. They may be they're being attacked, but I want to credit my department heads for always working so diligently to live within their budget. And we're just trying to figure out how we can cut where cutting is possible. So thank you.
Okay. So Linda, I believe you prepared a presentation for us to go through. Why don't we go ahead and start there?
I did, and the superintendent was going to open with some remarks. She's running late from another meeting, so we may go in reverse order. I may start and have her give her remarks when I'm done in the interest of time.
Thank you. That's fine.
Okay, so I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Can you see my screen?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, well, again, thank you for the opportunity to visit with you, to talk with you, and we are looking forward to the deep dive and better understanding. And welcome back to the BET. It's great to have you back as well. So glad you're here. And so what I wanted to do, I prepared some slides to kind of walk us through. You do have the book that we did send to you, but I thought it would be helpful if I just kind of spend some time walking through the numbers and the process that we go through to get us to where we are in the process, and then we can open it up for questions. I do have members of the cabinet also on the call, members of the finance team that can ask if you have any specific program-related information, not necessarily financial. They can also jump in and help answer the question.
Okay.
Linda, I'm
Yes.
sorry. I'm admitting Dr. Estrella as we speak.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. So the way that we look at this budget, we're going to take it back to FY22. And I know we've had these conversations because a lot of this year's budget, not a lot, but a big point of this year's budget are actions that occurred in FY22, and primarily was the level funding that year when we started getting ESSER dollars. And so as we go through this budget, you will kind of see how that fits into this budget, in addition to other elements. So I wanted to kind of spend some time. I just have 2 slides kind of recapping FY22 and how we got here. So when we started the budget back in for the FY22, the original budget began at a little over 208 million. We go through the process similar to the city where departments submit their request. At the time, the request came in at about 8%. Through the process of the superintendent, chief finance officer at the time, my friend Tom Hamilton, and the Board of Education at the time, review that budget, and trim down those numbers as you would expect to happen in any budget process. And so the budget that was eventually approved and sent over to the city, the request at that point was about 5.6%, down from the original 8% ask. In going through that budget process, we did receive some favorable health numbers throughout that process, and we were able to trim that budget back down by about $2 million to a revised BOE budget of about 4.6%, a $9.6 million increase at the time. Just as in any other budget process, obviously the city CFO and the mayor look at all the requests in totality and put forward a number that is, that takes into account the tax base, the taxes, use of fund balance. And at the time, the proposal from the city and the mayor was about an additional $5.4 million reduction to the Board of Ed. And so the proposal that eventually made out at the time was about a 2% increase over that prior year, still below what the request was. As we went through the budget process and getting to the point of approving the budget, as you know, this is when we received the dollars from the federal ESSER grants. Both the city and the board received those funds. And at that point, towards the end of that process, it was determined to keep the budget at zero and that the Board of Education was to make up those needs using the ESSER funds. In researching this, and many of you that were on the board at the time, we've looked at the BET meetings of that date. We've looked at the Common Council meetings, the Finance and Claims meetings of that date, and the discussions that surrounded that decision. And I think there was kind of uniform agreement that there could potentially be some challenges ahead. I think the one thing also to take into account at the time, the mayor had issued his executive order. Among the executive orders were that, the recipient of these ESSER funds, we could not lay off staff, and I don't think anybody had the intention of doing that at the time, and so we were limited in what we could do. Additionally, the ESSER funds on the school side, just like as they did on the city side, have very specific things that you could do, use those funds for. There were a series of one-time funds, which we applied those ESSER dollars for, which you have in what you have. But then there were these other areas that the ESSER funds identified us to do, to look at modifying the impact of the pandemic, address learning losses. And these are issues specific to the Board of Ed. These are issues that require people to manage. And therefore, at the time, when we were going through this process, these were some of the concerns that were raised, both by the board, both by the BET and the Common Council, was that, understanding these funds were one time, but also understanding that going from a budget of a 5.6% ask to a 0% ask, it was going to be challenging to apply the entirety of these funds on one-time issues to the extent that we could. And so anyway, we went through that process, but these were conversations that we had, and through the subsequent conversations with our budgets coming forward, we had put forward plans to somewhat incrementally address that flat funding of the time.
Yeah, and Linda, having been part of the BET, as a number of us were during that time, there's a couple of things here that I think we need to point out and be precise on, right? You're not talking about your budget on that prior page. You're talking about the portion of the budget that was funded through the city and through our taxpayers. The budget for the school system, because of ESSER funding and other grants, actually was significantly higher, right? And we had talked 2 years in a row about the fact that we strongly recommended plans and thinking around when that funding would disappear and how we address it together. So the fact that we're here is unfortunate, but there's two very important things within it. Depicting the budget the way you have is inaccurate because it does not show the true full spending by the Board of Ed. And yes, now we're in a situation based on the requirements around ESSER funding, despite having all acknowledged that this was going to be a problem, where it is now a problem and something we are going to have to figure out how to mitigate because of the realities of budgets and the requirements of and requests of our city, right? So
No, you're correct, Ed. And again, as I mentioned, these have been ongoing conversations. You know, we had this conversation last year. We had this conversation the year before, and there is ongoing different views on how those funds were used, what those funds were used for, what was the thinking when the 0% funding. But you know, we are where you are, to your point.
Right.
And at this point, we're looking forward to try to address.
yeah, but
how we
and
move
and
forward
again,
from
though,
there.
I just want to make sure for all of us and how we represent it back to the members of the community. Spend on education has continued to increase. Spend on education isn't flat. It came from different sources.
No, correct. And I do have a slide. Here, I'm specifically talking about the locally funded portion of the budget. And I think I had that highlighted up front, specifically on the local budget. I do have slides moving forward that speak to the monies from the grants and where they came from. And so hopefully that addresses your question, Ed. But yes,
Yeah,
my intent is to present the full picture,
Yep.
looking at both sides.
All right, thank you.
funding
I'll
sources.
try and stop interrupting at this point.
No, please do, please do. So this is the slide that kind of I'm referring to. And again, this is looking at that locally funded portion of the budget. We took it back to FY17, as you can see, in fiscal year 21, to your point, Ed, when there was that 0% funding and you see this flat lining of the line, we made up that difference using those federal dollars. I believe that was a conversation, that was the intent at the time. And then the year that followed, we were fortunate to receive a 4.5% increase. And here we are today working on the FY24 budget. What I did on this slide, just to show, had we followed the more traditional funding trajectory, if ESSER was not to have happened, if the Board of Ed was to have been funded by traditional historical numbers, not necessarily, you know, I use here 3.8%. For FY22, it could have been 2.5, it could have been 2. This is more just like a planning document, but it does show that there was a deviation in the more traditional trajectory of the local budget.
Yes, with offsets from other areas.
Absolutely.
Linda, could I ask
yes. Sure.
just a brief question?
Yes, Jim.
Do you have the same trajectory with the actual cost that doesn't include any surplus that you wound up with at the end of the year? Because these increases obviously are compounded every year.
I do have a slide. I don't have it in a chart like this, but I did include in the slides, and I think Tom shared with you, that does show the carryover funds for, I believe, for the same time period. I don't know if that answers the question.
But the picture I was looking for is that, you know, we acknowledge the fact that we're not going to cut your budget year over year, but from any budgeting is usually zero based. And what would be very, very helpful is to see what was actually spent versus what was asked for every year. Because what we're doing, our taxpayers are funding that. If you don't spend the money, we don't get the taxpayers don't get the money back. It goes into the fund balance, and then sometimes it's even and it can be rolled over into further spending on behalf of the Board of Ed. So it would be really useful to give us some indication of how you spent this money over these years, actual spending that took place versus what.
Sure. Okay. I can do an actual spending chart. I do have the actual spending in a graph that's coming up in 604 that'll show I think I have 3 years of actual spend, but I can also show a budget to actual if that would be helpful for you, Jim. I could put an actual to budget slide as well.
Okay, well, I'll sit back and wait for that.
Okay. So then what I wanted to talk about was just, you know, we're in the business of students, and I wanted to kind of share with you just some demographics of our students, because this leads into the population of the individuals we serve. So currently, within the Norfolk Public Schools, we have about 81% non-multi-language learners and close to 20% who are multi-language learners. We're almost 50-50 split in free and reduced lunches. In some sectors, this is an indicator of poverty and assistance in terms of our demographics. And we have about 17% of our students currently that have been identified as needing some type of specialized services. The reason we bring these up is because the resources that are necessary to educate free and multi-language learners, specialized learners, are significantly more than your regular education, what I refer to as regular education. And I'll weave into the next slide that kind of ties to that. So here what I show is at the state level, they refer to them as high need students. And by definition, a high need student is any student in your district that belongs to two or more of those three areas I just showed. And so if you have two or more of either multi-language, special needs, or free and reduced lunches, then they count towards your high needs population. And so the chart to the left shows just as a percentage how many high need students we have in the district. So if you go back to 2015, we were almost about 50%. Fast forward to where we are 2023, we're at 68%. Whereas if you look at the enrollment chart right next to it, it shows a relatively flat enrollment within the Norwalk Public Schools. So on the one hand, looking at the enrollment, you could say, well, why are there additional resources when your student population hasn't necessarily changed? Part of the answer to that question is the chart next to it, which is the high need student, because the proportion of funding that you're allocating to your high need student is more over time. And so paraeducators in the classroom, we've talked about.
But Linda, I'm sorry.
Sure.
Right, I understand that, but if I look at the chart on the left, our high needs population has been about 68% since 2019. I look at the enrollment history going back to 2019, and it's flat relatively.
Correct.
So the percentage has not changed, nor has the number of students affected, if you do it on a pure numbers basis, changed over the last 4 years.
Correct.
What has changed back to 2015?
What has changed is the cost of providing those services. So yes, it doesn't cost the same to educate the same 68% in 2020 as it does in 2023. Included in those costs are transportation costs, our paraeducator costs, our behavior interventionist costs. So that's an added element that's probably missing from this chart. But to your point, you're right. As a proportion, the percentages has not changed significantly over the past 5 years, but the cost to provide those services has. One of the challenges we're seeing now, especially since COVID, one, we've had a combination of, and there's a slide that's going to go into this. Not only have we had challenges staffing in-house for these positions, we have had to use third-party entities to provide those services, and those costs have gone up quite dramatically. If you follow the Board of Ed Finance Committee, we are estimating this year alone, just in special education costs for what we've budgeted. We had budgeted about $9.2 million for special education costs. Right now, we're projecting to spend about 10.4, and we have been doing a series of transfers within the year to the special education line items through our finance committee and the Board of Education to allocate for that. But you do raise a good point. As a percentage and as a proportion, it hasn't dramatically increased. What's really driving the special education increases are the costs associated with those, but then also the types of services, because one particular special education student and another, they all have different special education needs. And so depending on the mix of those needs within your population, that is also a driver of the cost. Rob Pennington and the superintendent are on, and they may be able to answer the programmatic question.
I think that, Jim?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, this is Dr. Estrella. One factor that also has to be taken into account is that the percent of high needs based on the free and reduced lunch applications that we utilize to identify this number is not completely accurate because of the fact that we were offering free lunch to all students. The number of applicants, students completing the free and reduced lunch application has decreased. And it doesn't fully represent the number of students that fall into this category at its totality. One of the things that we're currently doing to address this data gap is we're conducting a separate survey that we needed to first get approval from the state to make sure that we were allowed to do this. We got approval to do this, and we will have more accurate numbers because our high needs population is much greater than 68%. But we were not able to represent that yet in this graph because we're still collecting data that will most accurately represent this. One of the things that has shifted besides special education is the population of multilingual learners in the district at large that also require specialized service and instruction, and as a result incur increased costs. So as you recall, time back, there was some funding provided to address the population growth of multilingual learners in the district. And that population continues to require services and needs as they continue to move through the system. And more students continue to come into our education system. So the 68% is deceiving, and it's actually much greater than that. We will be providing better numbers soon, but we have to finish the survey that we are in the process of administering because of the fact that lunch forms are not required at this point because we are offering free lunch to all students.
My question was going to be, Linda, was based on the, to identify some of the increase in cost that you mentioned. I understood that was out of district tuition, is that correct?
Among those, yes, out of district
Okay.
tuition, out of district
So
transport.
several years ago, I remember actually Troy Jelleret and I sat in on a presentation regarding special ed, and it sounded like a great program where we were adding $3 million over a couple of years to address building up our special ed teachers so that we could keep some of those out of district tuitions down and offer more comprehensive quality of teaching and address some of those needs of the special education population. What happened to that money? Is that money was I think kind of a stimulus in the beginning and then carried through, and I assume that we have the same amount built into the budget today. Are we seeing just more out of district tuition? Have we changed the special education program some way or other? Are we still
I think Rob Pennington
allocating the same amount of funds? How do we spend the money?
Hi, good evening, everyone. So we still have those programs that were started to be developed with that $3 million. We currently have 321 students in those specialized programs, and that's across the district. But one of the things that amazing $3 million was able to do is start to build these programs. However, every year you're adding to that program. So if I start a program in kindergarten, that program would then go up to first grade and second grade. So there still is a development in that area. And then the only other piece that you asked was about out of district and what are we seeing is we are actually, we've seen a lot of mental health supports that have been developed because of the pandemic. And so as a specialized learning team, we are looking to see what new program we need to develop to help keep our students in district, because some of the new supports that are needed, we need to revamp and readjust our programs as well. So that is the two areas. I mean, we've seen that increase in need. But the programs that were developed are still in development, are still here. We're still developing them, and we're supporting a lot of our students in that area. But we've also seen an increase. I think if you go back a couple of years, our prevalence rate was 14.5%. And as of October 1 this year, we are at 15.3%. And that's still going up. So we are definitely seeing, and this is across the state, it's not just in Norwalk, but we're definitely seeing increased needs and supports.
Just a quick question on the 321 that you mentioned. I thought we had special ed somewhere in the neighborhood of about 11 to 1,200 students.
We do, but you were asking about specialized programs that were developed with that $3 million. And that those were programs that when that money was allocated, these were very specific programs that were developed to support higher need students that before they were developed, those students were going out of district.
Right.
So I'm just like, so right now, these programs are supporting students in district. And we have in those specialized programs that were developed, currently 321 students in those very specific programs. I'm not talking about supporting all students, because we have students that are in classrooms and getting specialized learning support, but not that very specific program that was developed to support our higher needs students.
Okay. But that money is baked in there and continues to be there. It was added and never taken out. So I mean, it's not like we're underfunding it all of a sudden, correct?
Can you restate that question again?
I said the $3 million was added in initially and it stays there. It wasn't taken out. It wasn't just a one-time thing. It continues to be there. We add on more and more every year.
That is correct. One of the things that we need to that needs to be taken into account is that the initial funding that was provided was to initiate those programs. Those programs are continuing to grow over time. As students transition through their grades, we're building a K-12 continuum of services. And we are still in developing of these programs to ensure that we are offering special education services within the district from grades K to 12. We actually have a presentation that we can share with the BET that we presented at one of our workshops that speaks in great detail to the programs that were developed with the funding provided, and how those programs have been growing over time to make sure that we're meeting the needs of the diverse student population that we're serving. Would that be helpful if we send that to you?
In the interest of time, Ed, let's put that on our list of things that we want to follow up on.
Yes, so Dr. Estrella, please do send that presentation, and yes, we'll make a note for that to discuss that further in our session on Monday. Troy, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Just to add on quickly, yes, Jim and I attended that a couple of years ago, and not only did the $3 million was there to that was the money that was put up front there was supposed to generate savings, which meant keeping kids in district, which should have funded the program even if it did go up in price, and even if there were more children involved. That's the number I want to see also, because we were given projections back then of what that $3 million was going to generate in additional savings that would go back into the program. So, I mean, it was pretty clear at the time, but.
And we have those slides that will show you how much money we have saved over time because we have brought our students back to being serviced within the district. So we have those slides. We will also send you the link to the actual presentation when Mr. Pennington and the rest of the team presented to the board and the public on the topic. And it was, I believe, in November that this workshop took place, and we will be more than happy to forward that to you tonight.
Thank you very much, Dr.
And
Stern.
I would just add the predictive value of the number of students that were outplaced when that $3 million came in around about $42 million in savings over the last 6 years. So I do want to just say that that did save money over time, but we also had a pandemic that has really impacted our students significantly over the last few years. So I
So
just
you're
want,
saying that $3 million, that you got my attention when you said $42 million savings. That $3 million, that investment generated a $42 million savings?
predictive based on the number of students that, because we had an X number of students that were outplaced. And then as the programs were built, we were able to support students in district versus if those students
Right.
were to go
Yeah, but-
outplaced, it would have cost roughly.
Okay, but
$42
but it's
million.
predictive. It's not
It-
true green
correct.
dollars.
It
right?
is
It's-
a
it's not
predictive value
true
if
green
those
dollars.
students were outplaced.
Right, so again, in an effort to keep the conversation moving, if we could get all those materials. Again, the point is, there's money in the program that's reinvested every single year. The program generates savings, which should then self-fund a portion of the increases year to year. And that's what we as a BET would like to understand where we sit on that.
Yeah, just one more thing on that, because if that's a $42 million prediction that we had, then something is amiss, because we wouldn't be in this situation looking at these numbers so diligently. Thank you.
I think that the thing that has to be taken into account is how costs have increased significantly relative to what those costs were in the past. Because of shortage areas and the pandemic, different agencies and support structures are costing us much more than they did in the past. Even when we're looking at what the state reimbursement rates were, they have recalculated and restructured their formula, which has not been to the benefit of districts. That has also created additional costs.
And
So we
that's
will,
fair.
in that presentation, that information is there and will be very helpful for all of you to look at, because it will answer many of the questions you were asking tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Estrella. And again, all departments, not just the Board of Education, are facing significant increase in costs, but we're all trying to figure out how to offset and manage those increases as we go through this whole process. So thank you.
Yeah, and we're doing every effort possible to minimize costs by continuing to expand programs in-house and ensure that outplacement is at a minimum and
Yeah.
only when desperately necessary.
Yeah, understood. And again, it's just trying to understand what is the actualized savings and reinvestment, and then the gap to new costs, because that's what we don't see right now. Not
Understood.
the predictive. So Linda, sorry,
Well, the
maybe we'll let,
predictive is based on what the kids need.
Yep.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yep.
But the
Linda.
predictive is based on what it would have cost if the child was continuing to receive the services out of district, which
understood.
is as accurate as we can possibly provide.
Understood. It's just not actualized. That's all.
But
Linda,
that was-
maybe we let you get off page
Yeah.
6.
Go.
Jim, are you good?
Yeah, I'm great.
Okay.
No, I just, let's take a look at the numbers, and I want to see where that money went. I mean, I understand what everybody's saying, but let's follow the numbers, okay?
Okay.
Yep.
So then I wanted to briefly talk about, before I get to the numbers, kind of a staffing distribution, because this is something that also come up through various discussions, and so I think it's helpful. And I did see that there is a chart. I'm not sure who requested it, but Tom did mention that I should also show a staffing trend. So I have, and so this is kind of leading to that. So you will get to see that, but just as a point in time, just to kind of get a better understanding of how the staff are distributed within the district. Obviously, the elementary schools is where the majority of our staff reside, followed by high school and middle school. And then as you can see, that on the continuum, that's kind of the distribution of our staffing. And the reason I bring this slide up is when we start talking about potential staff reductions and where those staff reductions occur, this chart does bear bearing where we would be looking at to make some of those reductions, and not necessarily proportionately, but that's why we share this slide with you. And then finally, I just have some slides.
Can I just ask a quick question? Is on page 20 of your presentation, you have headcount of 1903. How does that relate to this headcount is 2173? Is
Sure,
that just
no, that's an excellent question. And I didn't put that in brackets. So what, obviously we talk about full-time equivalent positions, and that's what you have on the slide on page 20. This is actually looking at just the head counts. We call it belly buttons for insurance purposes, just where the physical people actually reside. So it doesn't necessarily translate into FTE. Some of these are part-time people, but just in essence of where are the heads within the district.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So then I wanted to talk about, because I don't think in our conversations with you, we have shared essentially how these budgets are built. How do we come up with these numbers? And the process is very similar to you on the city side. And so you can see this is an Excel spreadsheet of our IT department. Each of these tabs below represent an account that feeds into the bigger number. And so in this instance, just to show like how this particular department is built. So this is the level of granularity that we go into with our departments in building these budgets before the numbers get to you. So we have a series of tabs for every single department. We ask them to justify what it is they're asking for. We verify these numbers. Are these consistent? If they're contract, we ask to review those contracts just to make sure that we are truly requesting what is needed. And then obviously, as we go through this process, we also have an internal process similar to the city side, where myself and the team and the superintendent, after these requests are done, before they get to you, we have a process of internal reviewing and we make these modifications. So here's an example of a curriculum where you can see what their initial request was. And my team working with the superintendent, before this number made it to you, we did some internal adjustments and made some modifications and reductions to these numbers. And so the numbers that you receive from us have already kind of gone through some level of filtering. They're not just blanket requests that just flow their way through the board without any particular review. And here's another example. And we do this for every single department, every single tab, justification, what it is for, the dollar amount per unit, and so forth. But I just thought that this would be helpful for you just to kind of get an understanding of how these numbers get to where they get before they get to you. And then finally, sticking on the staffing side, there has been discussion about, well, how many vacancies do you have? And I do want to compliment our recruiting team. They have done a really tremendous job of lowering this number. If this is a snapshot, I believe, taken on Monday or Friday of last week. If you go to the website without doing any analysis, you will see at the time there were 72 vacant positions. And what we like to share is also some of these vacancies they're not all created equal. So the pie chart on the left just looks at two buckets of vacancies. We have what we call long-term substitutes and these non-substitute positions. So of those 72, 20 long-term substitute positions, what that means is if we have a teacher that's on maternity, if we have an employee that's on FMLA, we have to fill that position and have somebody in that specific classroom. And so when you look at these vacancies, you would have to kind of discount that 20 because we're essentially backfilling for positions that we already have, but they're on maternity. And so the actual vacancies at any given time, at least at this particular day, was 52. And so in looking at those 52 positions, which is the pie chart, we have teachers that are shortage areas at any given time. We really work hard to recruit. So we have 10 shortage area teachers. We have 5 non-shortage area teachers. And then we have what we refer as non-certified positions. So these would be like your para-educators that help special education learners in the classroom. These are people that work in our cafeterias. These are people, custodians, security, and so forth. And the reason I bring this up is in the course of conversations, as we go to how will the Board of Ed reconcile this budget? I think I heard a comment that, well, you have 72 vacant positions. Why not just start with those vacancies? And so this is important just to somewhat educate that these vacancies, there's some methodology to these vacancies. But this is what we will be looking at as we move
And
forward.
Linda, just a question for clarity, please.
Sure.
Shortage area versus non-shortage area, how do you define that, please?
I'll let Rob speak to it. I can try to answer, but I think I'm going to butcher the answer. It's subject specific. Or maybe Dr. Estrella also can help. What we first areas.
I would just say, well, go ahead, Dr. Estrella.
So shortage areas are defined by hard to staff roles. For instance, special education is considered a shortage area because it is really hard to identify personnel to fill those vacancies. Bilingual educators are another example of a shortage area because they're hard to staff, hard to identify individuals with the certification to fill those vacancies. So normally any content area or specialized certification that is difficult to staff is considered a shortage area.
Thank you very much.
So now we get to the numbers. So of our total budget, which to your point, Ed, earlier, is the total piece of the pie is 287 million. In the current tentative approved, which is the request you have before you, 245 million is the locally funded portion. We are fortunate, we are an alliance district, and we receive other competitive and non-competitive grants. About 34.7 million are grant funds that we apply to supplement our budget. And then we also have our food services fund, which is somewhat self-sustaining, but it does require some offsets. And so the reason we show this chart is it does truly cost whatever the actual number ends up being, but for the budget, that's the total cost. And so what we're saying here is about 75 to 80% is locally funded, but we do provide additional funding, or you provide additional funding to the school from non-local funds. But that's truly what it takes to run the district. It's not just the 245, but it's actually the 287, including all sources. And we have positions, services, and individuals that are serviced out of these buckets.
Yeah, it would be helpful to see that pie chart on a 3-year basis. I mean, maybe we can get to it through some of these charts here. We can derive that.
Yeah, sure.
But
So,
again, it shows I will say this and it will come out wrong, but it will show.
I'm ready.
No, by looking at it over the 3-year period, it shows the significant increase in pressure we're putting on the city side this year versus historically what we have done. And I think, again, it's important for everyone to understand, right, that city side funding is not the full budget. The full budget for the Board of Ed for education, I shouldn't call it the Board of Education, for education has continued to increase year to year to year, every single year. Sources
Correct.
may be different, and now we're in a situation because of decisions that were made in the past where we're putting undue pressure on the city side to make up for areas where funding no longer exists or no longer exists. I'll stop there.
correct.
I think it's also important to note. I think it's important to note that if it was up to us, we wouldn't want to have to engage in increases. I think we're very cognizant of the strains that this costs the community. That's why we're constantly looking for grant funds and other sources outside of the taxpayers' pocket to fund education. But I also think it's important to highlight that we have contractual obligations through collective bargaining that continue to increase every year that we have to fulfill. And also,
as do most of our departments in the city who have union contracts.
Correct. And I think the Board of Education was the only one that was flat funded, right? And
Again, that's a portion of the funding. The narrative on flat funding really bothers me. I'm sorry.
My point? And I understand that. But we have to take that into account, that part of the challenge that we're currently having, and we've been talking about this for the past 3 years, has been as a result of the fact that that year, our contractual obligations continued to increase, and we did not get the funding necessary to address the increase in those contractual obligations. We had a governor's order, executive order, as well as a recommendation from the BET to utilize ESSER dollars to address that issue in itself during that year, to make sure we could to continue to have the staff that we needed to meet the needs of our students. I know that we are in a difficult situation this year, and we're going to try our best to get through this. But I think there needs to be a recognition that part of the challenges that we are currently having has been in part as a result of that, as well as the compounded challenges that we've had with increased healthcare costs, as well as increased costs associated with services that is greater than what we have experienced in the past. And we have made a concerted effort, as I think everyone else, to minimize costs as best as we possibly can. I think it was articulated earlier as one example with special education, and making sure that we are bringing services in-house to mitigate costs as best as we possibly can. So I just think it's important to note that we will provide you with the 3-year projection as you requested, but I think it's important to also highlight that the challenges that we have now have been as a result of some of the things that we've been discussing for 3 years.
Understood. And there is issue on all sides in how we chose to address that. However, the challenges you are facing are no different than any other department in the city and or any public or private organization. And we need to start to look more aggressively at how we address those things, because at some point, this balloon bursts, and we're getting to that point.
If I'm
So I
to continue,
understand your
I do
comments,
have the
Dr.
slide,
Estrella.
I do have the slide. We're
I
talking
hear
about
you.
the 3-year, sorry. Ed, you're
No, I
talking
just
about
said
the
I heard
3-year.
Yep.
No, you were talking about the 3-year history. So the next 3 slides hopefully address that. So what I do here is I look at those 3 pieces of the pie, and I do show 3 years worth of actual and the year, and then what the approved budget is. So on the grant side, you could see that beginning in 2020, we were 24, 32. You'll see this dramatic increase these 2 years, and that is those ESSER funds that came through the system. In 24, the budget that we're in, you see this 26% decrease, which is indicating that those ESSER funds are going away. And so, so this looks at the grant side in that 5-year with actuals history. I do the same.
Luna, can I just ask a
Yes.
quick question on that?
Please.
That increase, you're only, take the ESSER funds out of there, which is the accounts for the 46 million. But you're still only growing at a very small amount from 32 to 34. What's the shortfall there?
Well, 32 to 34 is just going back. Those at this point were more back to the statutory grants that we're getting from the state.
Right.
And those are the projections that we have at this time, what those grants will be. We're kind of going back to that traditional funding with the Alliance District grants. And if you look at, I don't know if you have the budget book with you, I actually break down this grant number by the individual grant programs. And you can actually see what are the individual grants that make up that 34.7 million. I do the same thing for the trajectory. You could see each one of our major grants in this exact same format.
Yeah.
If that would be helpful.
And thank you for that. I did see that in there. I guess what Jim is raising and what I would raise as well is we continue to hear you say you're being even more aggressive, looking for grants, finding other opportunities for funding. Yet the reality is when you look at like to like, taking out the ESSER funding, we're not seeing, it doesn't appear that there is success in being more aggressive looking for grants.
Ed,
No,
can
the
I just be-
bigger,
Can I
most
just
of
be
our,
Just a second, can I just be a little bit more explicit? Let's take a look at supplies and materials. You know, we were at 3.1 million, and now we're talking about less than 900,000. What happened there?
Supplies and materials, largely that was driven, well, one of it was driven by the ESSER funds. But then when we get these grants, some of these
The
grants,
ESSER funds wouldn't have anything to do with that, would it?
no, but
ESSER funds,
Jim, some of
Yeah.
these grants are very specific to what you can use them for. There's
Okay.
some years you get grants that can fund personnel. There's some year you receive grants that we apply for equipment and technology. Some years these grants have different restrictions. So this is just looking at them in totality. So it's not like we can't charge supplies to every single grant. There's some grants that prohibit for you from charging supplies.
got it.
And
But
so-
but I mean, that's one of the biggest decreases from 2021 to 23, 24. That's the biggest decrease that you got there. That's a significant, it's almost $2 million. 1.5 million.
Well, you have the
What would-
salaries and benefits is also a big driver. You'll see that
Yeah,
goes up.
same thing. I mean, equipment too. Equipment, you're
Right.
down like $1 million.
Right. And that just depends on the grant. You know, we apply for grants. Some
Well,
grants
yeah,
are
Linda,
program specific.
I'm sorry, this is what we did with, we did this with all the other city departments. And I guess it gets annoying, and I don't mean to be annoying.
No,
But
not at all.
answer
I don't think you're annoying.
I think one of the things that we also
Obnoxious
have to take
maybe,
into
but not
account
annoying.
that we.
But so my question is that of that
I-
million, let's take equipment, for example.
Okay.
You know, what happened to $1.2 million? Is that there's got to be a significant chunk of it. Is it 200,000 was the largest chunk, or 300,000, or $1 million that somebody didn't come through with in a grant? I just need an explanation, that's all.
We can get you, I mean, so maybe let me back up a little bit. So in the document that you have in the budget book, I show every
And I
single.
apologize, I didn't, I'm
No,
out of
that's
town,
fine.
I don't have my budget book with me at all times.
No, that's fine. So in the document that you have, beginning on page 45, beginning on page 47, I have shown every single grant that totals to this by grant. In addition to a schedule that shows it by grant, I also show that same schedule for each grant where those grants were used. So if this particular grant was used at Brian McMahon, and so I provide that information as well. Maybe if you look at that, and if there's another way to slice this information, because the data is there, I can slice this however way you would like. But the numbers are there, they're in the system. It's just a matter of running a report. If you want to see the grant by these categories, I can give you all the 45 grants by these categories over time. And
Well,
maybe
then let's
so
make it
I mean,
simple, though. Let's just make it simple. For supplies, materials, and equipment, just tell us, give me a variance analysis, why that a significant drop.
I can do that.
I think Jim, and Jim, I think in part that difference is because we had a lot of ESSER supplies and equipment that we purchased during that time that was necessary, that are not things that we need to replenish at this time. So you'll see that in the breakdown.
So to that point, Dr. Estrella, and there's no way to know this. I understand it. We can only apply for grants, and then it's up to the funding organization as to whether or not we will get the grants. Are we confident on things like salary and benefits that we have applied for every single grant available to us to help increase those numbers, since that's driving the bulk of your increases as well?
I can assure you we have it. Trust me. Well, you don't have to trust me.
Yeah,
But that's my
understand.
assurance. I think.
I'm sorry, and we've been quite successful at all of the grants that we've been applying for to actually receive them. I think a better comparison, because if I recall this correctly, the numbers in 21, 22, 22, 23 encompass ESSER dollars, and looking at 2019, 20 and 20, 23, 24 are better ways of maybe looking at this, because it looks at the funding without the ESSER dollars compounded. And you will see that we have been quite successful at increasing the grant revenue across the district versus looking at it when you have ESSER dollars compounded into other grants that we have been applying for that are
Okay.
competitive grants.
Okay, and I'm not trying to trap anybody with this comment, but earlier Linda implied, or I inferred from Linda's statement, I should say it that way, that the ESSER impacts were in the 21-22 actuals and the 22-23 approved. So that's why both Jim and I and all of us are looking at 2021 actuals to 2023-24 approved and not seeing much movement there. If you're saying that there's ESSER in the 2020-21 numbers, I'd like to understand how much we think is in that number so that it is a fair and flat comparison.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, I think that would be helpful.
Can I make a comment? Jim and Ed, I used to sit on the Board of Estimate and Taxation with you, you'll recall, and we were together when we decided to flat fund the district. But I also just wanted to kind of give some context about education in comparison to other city departments. And that is that we get students who come to us throughout the year with a multitude of different challenges and learning styles. And so I believe the district, the administration does the best that they can to really be able to predict what the needs are going to be. But quite often that's not the case because you don't always know the type of needs you're going to get in terms of our student population. So, and you know, we're not dealing with commodities here. We're talking about students who are coming here to learn. And we are a labor-intensive agency because what we are producing are students who we are teaching and helping them to learn and to be academically successful and to be civically engaged. And so in some ways, folks could argue that it may be a moving target because it's a challenging thing to do. It's not like in the city where you are going to repave a parking lot or redo a park. When it comes to educating our children, it's a little different. And that's not to say that I don't appreciate all of our collective concerns around the budget. I understand that, I appreciate that. I'm just trying to provide some context in terms of how we look at educating students and the funding that's needed for that. And that's it.
Not arguing that at all, Sherry, just looking at the sources for that funding as hard as we can.
Could I make a comment, please?
Please, Henry.
Linda, could you go back to the slide, the pie chart, please, with the total spending? So really appreciate that you're looking at 245 from us, but the total is 287, okay? What's not on this chart is the 30 million of in-kind services that the city side provides to the Board of Education, whether it's our accounting department, our legal department, our IT. So it's 30 million that we're spending on our side, which is for your benefit. So that would bring that up to $317 million. If you add the $30 million that the state pays for teacher pensions, the total cost to provide the educational services for our district is $347 million. When I divide that by 11,600 enrollment, I get a total of $29,913 per student. And I understand some are special ed, high needs, but 29,913 is an enormous amount of money when you compare it to any other district in this country.
So looking at slide 15, which is the tax funded portion of the budget. So that concludes those three pieces of the pie. I provide this information as well, the salaries, benefits, the categories within the budget book. I believe there was a question on the line item, and I think Tom sent you the page where this number is broken down into specific object category items. It begins on page, I think it was page 40. Begins on page 39. So the same information, this is summarized on the slide, but in your budget book, you have all the salary series, the benefit series, all the way to the bottom until you have those individual line item information in the book that you have.
Mhm.
So what I wanted to close off, sorry, Ed, you had a question?
I just want to know if we have any view of 2023 forecast actuals.
2020.
The blue box here, approved 2022, 2023, we have approved. Do you have any view of
Oh,
forecast actuals for this fiscal year?
I don't. I don't at this time for a number of reasons. If you recall, and I think I have a slide towards the end that kind of talks about, because I think there was a question about what do we anticipate to roll over at the end of the year. If you don't mind, can we wait until we get to that slide, Ed?
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
But
Thank
yes,
you.
I was informed that you wanted to see that, so I did provide that schedule, and I'll spend some time talking about that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So now just
Just
go ahead.
quickly, we've been asking this question of every other department, but we got 18 million, we have $22 million of other services. I guess that's broken down in the book, but is there anything, what are some of the more significant pieces of that?
Of other services?
Yeah, $22 million of other, it's up $4 million over, it's up $3 million over last year.
Right, so other services is our 500 series, which is on page 40. The biggest driver for that number has to do, that's where we pay our special education to other entities that's out of district. Included in that is out of district transportation. That accounts for about almost $2 million of the increase. And then we also have, yeah, those are the two major drivers in the 500 series, which is the other services. There's a line item on page 40.
Is it, and that'll be included in that analysis that you're going to send us on when we discuss the special ed, right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. But each of these categories, the corresponding line item is included in the schedules from page 39 to 41.
Okay.
Any questions before I move on?
No, thank you.
So now what I wanted to show is obviously talk about what's driving the budget. You know, we've had this conversation about the 12.7% increase. How did we get here? And then there's a cap that's been recommended and did want to close by, okay, what's the Board of Ed going to do? And how do we move forward from here? So just to recap, we began the budget with 217 million. We looked at what we refer to as the base budget request, which is basically our contractual wages for the position that we have, salaries, bargaining unit, contracts, different contracts that we have, and services. Again, going back to that initial spreadsheet that I shared in how we build the budgets, that's how we get to the 5% minus the reductions we had made. The superintendent mentioned, obviously for us, at least from our perspective, the level funding in 21 is a big driver for our budget. And I think there could be conversations whether that was the right thing to do. Did the Board of Ed spend the money the way that was instructed or not instructed to be spent? But in any event, we had a chunk of positions that were funded using the grants. And now that the grant has expired, I think my predecessor referred to it as the cliff. Those positions exist, and now we're facing this this number. But that's a driver. That's how we get to get the number. I will have Rob Pennington talk about the special education and what's driving those numbers. And then we did have these additional positions for interventionists that we'll also be discussing. But that's essentially how we get to the 12.7% of the budget.
Yeah, and again, it's kind of, it's optics. I understand it, right? But I think we need to represent the full optics, right? And that is This is the city side funded portion of the budget, less the in-kind services. The actual budget and actual spend was larger in each of these years, right? Due to grants, ESSER, et cetera, right? And what you're coming back to is saying, since though what we're all coming back to is a situation that says, since those are going away, we want the city side to absorb 100% of the gap. And I think the question to all of us needs to be, A, is that realistic? And B, are there other opportunities to look in some of those, again, those other funding lines? And
Right.
you talked to it already to say, can we go harder at grants? Can we go harder at, anything else to help offset that? Right? Because you're saying the other parts of my pie have declined, so therefore, City of Norwalk, you must be the one to increase.
So I will make a slight modification to that, Ed, because the city, the Board of Ed received almost $48 million in ESSER dollars over the life of ESSER. And I think the city received a likely number. We're not asking for $48 million, right? That's how much we lost, but that's not what we're asking, because within that $48 million, there are a number of one-time things that we spent those dollars on, knowing that they're one-time, and we're not asking the city to replenish 100% of what was lost by ESSER. The only portion of the ESSER dollars that we are referring to here, and that's why we share the ESSER slides. I've showed the grants to show what the piece of the pie is. We're not asking for the city to give us all of the ESSER funds that we lost. What we're saying in this slide is basically two things. Of the $47 million that we received in ESSER, we applied those for certain things that are one time that we're not asking for. However, when we came, just as we are coming today, 2 years ago, with the budget, with these contractual increases, and when we were told, make up that funding by using these grant dollars, this is what we did. And we can argue whether that was the right thing or the wrong thing, but I think I want to point out that the Board of Ed is not asking for the city to replenish all that was lost by ESSER. And then I think the other thing, Ed, if I may finish, the other thing I also point out in full transparency, we did say, and that's why we separate the ESSER dollars. If you see that driver D bucket, there were positions that did not exist before ESSER that we created with the ESSER dollars because we knew that there was a need, and because ESSER specifically said, these are things that we want these funds to address. And in doing so, we hired interventionists to address these positions. We understand that the funding has gone. We feel that the need remains, but we didn't want to just lump everything together. So in full transparency, we separated those out to be transparent and to show there are positions beyond the zero flat funding that was issued that we made the Board of Ed made a conscious decision because we felt that the ESSER needed, we felt that the student needed, and we include them as a separate line item, not to bury them within all of the other line items. And that's why we specifically carved those positions out, just so that we can have the conversation whether this is something we want to go forward with, or how should the district make do with that.
And I appreciate everything you said, right?
But
yes, but, right? But I just want to be clear, right? Whether it's ESSER funding or even on your side or on the city side, I would completely agree. We all had portions of that funding that I would call were limited use investments. So no, it's not 48. We can add up the number here that, we're looking to put back, but the story is still the same. We're putting the full burden of what we need to reinvest on the city side, right? Understand why, but I'm simply saying, have we been as creative as we should be and as possible in putting pressure on those other slices of the pie as well to look to increase that funding?
Ed, you'll recall, I believe, Mr. Asmani indicated that the district has brought in millions of dollars in grants. It's just that, you know, more funding is required, but this administration has been very aggressive in securing grants.
Yeah, but Sherry, I'm sorry, based on the data that's here, I don't see that because pre-ESSER, pre-pandemic, we had about 32 million in grants. Now for next year, we're forecasting 34 million. Now you could say 2 million is aggressive. I could say it's not.
So
Not
let me
based
ask
on
you
the-
this. Let me ask you this. So what I will say is this, that, you know, perhaps we need to ask ourselves the question, when we did flat fund the district at that time, what was the expectation in terms of where that shortfall was going to be made up? Because we were warned, right, that it was going to be a challenge. And I also want to remind everyone that we're talking about a organization that employs almost 2,000 people. And Mr. Asmani, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know the exact number. I should know that. But I believe it's close to 2,000 people. And we have a school district of almost 12 million kids.
12,000.
11,650, something like that. I believe that's our number.
11,000, not million, 11,000.
Right, but
Which is flat over the last 4 years.
However, and I don't know if this came up, we are seeing though an incidence of young people with higher needs though. So when you
Again,
say,
I can only respond to the data I've seen. 68%
right. Well, you know,
of
it's
the
difficult.
population
It's
is
difficult for
higher
you
needs.
guys. It's hard for you guys to understand that because we're looking at 6 months to a year's more worth of work, and then you're getting educated about this in about, I don't know, a month, a week. So it is a challenge for you to be able to comprehend all that goes into that in such a short period of time.
I would argue it's not a comprehension challenge. I think we understand it. I think it's an affordability challenge for the citizens of Norwalk that we all have to wrestle with. Education is critically important. It absolutely supports the future of the city. It brings in better individuals wanting to live here. I get that, but we have to balance that with the citizens who are here now and today. Right? This is hard for all of us. None of us want to be in this situation, but we are, and we have to balance the needs of our students with the needs of the rest of the city population. And we're pushing hard because we have to challenge one another on every penny because it makes a difference on both sides. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Mr. Pennington, can you talk about the drivers of special education? And then I can move to the next slide.
Sure, there are 4 drivers. I will start with the out-of-district costs, which we've already mentioned briefly earlier. Just to go back in time a little bit, in 2015-16, there were 163 students outplaced. At this time, we are looking at 102, which is the same as 2018-19 pre-pandemic. The pandemic did adjust that because students were at home. So I do want to highlight that component, that we did see a decrease during the pandemic, and we are currently at 102, which is similar to where we were in 18-19, just to frame that reference. But that is all based.
Can I just, I'm sorry, just quick. You're saying that the number of out of district was the same in 2018
Correct.
as it is today?
That is correct.
What happened to the program that we put $3 million into?
Well, the money that was developed was back further than that, when we had 163 outplaced. We went from 163 all the way down to, at one point, 80 students that were outplaced, because it does ebbs and flows. But that money was used to help develop those programs to get the number of students outplaced lower. So going from that 163, that's when the district started to develop specialized programs to keep students in district. And that's what that money was used for. That's where we see it. We see that drop. And we see a drop. We go 163 down to 140, down to 113, down to 102. So you see a substantial drop over time. We hit the pandemic. We were at a place of 80. We come out of the pandemic. We're seeing significant needs. We go from roughly 80 to 102 over those 2 years. We still have, as I mentioned, 321 in those specialized programs that if we did not have, there are some of those students who would be in an out of district placement. So I just want to highlight that those programs that were developed with the $3 million are still substantial to us. But we are at a place where we do have an increase, which you can see here. And some of those reasons are, I can highlight a couple of those reasons. One are students who have school avoidance or mental health supports that are needed. We also, as a district, the state of Connecticut increased services and increased supports for students. We used to have to pay for students up to the age of 21. We now have to support students up until the day before their 22nd birthday. So that was adjusted just last year. And we have students that would have exited our district that are now still, or exited programs that are still in programs for another year. So that is another cost that the state has rolled out to districts across the state. We also have grants that we get for specialized learning because a lot of the things that we have to implement are based on the IEP, which are mandated by law. And one of the pieces that happened is the state has raised the threshold for reimbursement. It used to be around $88,000. It is now $96,000, which means we will be getting less money coming back from those different grants. The third one is we have staff, as Dr. Estrella mentioned earlier. She mentioned that special education is a high need position and staffing. When a staff member leaves the district, we have to bring in contracted services, because if we fall behind on services, we're either going to pay a contractor to come in and support those students while we find another staff member, or it's going to cost us more in the long run. And so we bring in, say, a speech and language pathologist from a contracted company to provide speech to our students in district while we look to hire another provider. And then the last driver is our other services. We have technology services that we need to bring in, also staffing, and we run ESY, which is mandated per the student's IEP that happens every summer. So those are our drivers that we have for next year that are showing some of those increases.
So these are all incremental over last year. Is that what you're saying?
These are all incremental over the last year and a half, yes.
And so how was how much did we have did we spend last year on, or this year, I should say, on these, in these areas?
So I'll talk about out of district. This year, we are spending roughly 10.4 million, which I think Lunda mentioned earlier. Last year, we spent around 9 million. So that you can see the difference. And that's for out of district costs. And then in the other areas, like I said, the grant redistribution is something that is new for next year. We get certain monies back. We're going to get less money back. We have to make adjustments.
No, but what I'm saying this year, what's our projection for this year? For the out of district cost projection for this year is what? 10.4?
10.4.
And so that's what it's going to be this year.
Yes, that,
And we don't have any more, we don't have any additional students.
I mean, you can get a student that moves into the district tomorrow.
Okay, that's one student. So I mean, but I'm saying that your demographics show that you don't have any big jump in population. To get to $2 million in addition for out-of-district costs means that you've got to have quite a few new students that are going to require that.
Not necessarily.
You're-
Some of the out-of-district programs can cost 300,000 for 1 year. Some can cost 400,000. So I just want to say, it doesn't take a lot of students to increase out-of-district costs.
Right. So how do you estimate that? I mean, we haven't seen a great. If you've got 102, which is the same number you had in 2018, why would it all of a sudden increase to cost you another almost or $2.2 million?
Because
What's the basis of that? I mean,
we've
you must have
also,
some demographics that you know that you're going to have 4 more students, 7 more students that are going to come in at $300,000.
so the other layer, it's just going to give some dollar amounts. In 2019-20, out of district was roughly $8 million. Last year, we're looking at roughly 9 million. We budgeted $9 million this year, and we have an increase, which is what Mr. Osmani talked about. So we saw that we have an increase this year. We budgeted, I think it's roughly 9.03 million, and we're going to be at 10.4. So that increase is happening like it happened this year with some of our students that are going through different situations.
I'm still puzzled with why, if we had 102 in 2018, we have 102 this year. I know, yes, costs do go up,
They
but
do.
I
Well,
don't understand how you can get to almost $2.2 more million. You know,
because
maybe
even
there's-
though the student number might not, because even when the student number might not be increasing, the composition of those students are shifting continuously. You might have had 102 students 7 years ago. Those are not the same students that might be part of that 102 population that we're talking about now. And the composition of that of the student body will create the variation in cost based on the programming need. So,
okay, let's put that aside for a second. What about the next 3? I mean, these are all the same thing. I mean, if we haven't had a population increase, I gotta see, what is the big, do we have the number of students, that's 102 that go to out of district? What about the grant redistribution? How do we get 2.2? Do we have the same number of people?
But our prevalence rate, which is the number of students who are identified for special education, was 14.5% last year. We are currently at 15.4%. So you can see that that number is going up. When we talk about our high needs, I know that Ed earlier was talking about that number looks the same. However, in special education and multilingual learners, those numbers have gone up. That number has gone up to 15. And so we are mandated to support those students based on their needs, whether it be the need for a paraeducator, whether it need for speech services, social work services, whatever those services are. And so those numbers have gone up. Yes, our population number may have stayed the same, but the prevalence rate or the number of students who are receiving
I really do appreciate what you're saying, and this is a sensitive area, and I am not trying, under any circumstances would I want to cut this, but I really just want to understand how we get these projections, how we come to these projections. And can we get another analysis of these items, this $6.3 million, what last year our projection is for this year, what are due to increased costs, what are some of those costs, and I don't have to have every single one, just the major drivers, and then how we come to the 6.3. We've got other things that we want to cover, I know, so Ed, if we could put this on our list, I think we can do it with the other analysis that we asked earlier on the special ed side.
And I know that the presentation was sent over that will have all of the breakdown, so you can take a look at the various charts and look at out of district over time. You can look at.
But let's be clear though, do the charts, I mean, these are great presentations that you guys give, and I appreciate the amount of numbers that you're churning through. But I want to have specifics that say, this is a cost that went up. This is the driver that drove this cost. This is the cost per head. This is the idiosyncrasies of this particular issue, and this is why I can point to a company that raised the price by X number of percent. Okay, that's all.
May I just, not to beat a dead horse here. You're talking about 102 students, each of which have their own specific plan.
Right.
Therefore, you should be able to, of any part of the budget, be able to predict what their costs may be. You may have a contingency in there. Yes, there are some students that may cost $300,000 or $400,000 a year, but I would say that is more of a, they're not all 100 of them are costing that level of funds. Therefore, to ask of what the drivers are, and you should be able to even give to us this analysis by student without cost for 100 students, given the level of variance there is in the budget here.
We can do that.
Okay, thank you. So the ask is clear on this. Thank you.
Yes, we'll get that to you. And let us know how you want to present it, whether in a report, if you want us to come back to talk about it. However,
Let's start with it in a report, a detailed email item. Let's start with it in writing, and then we'll see if we
Okay.
need to follow up with additional questions, if that's okay.
we can do that.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to skip past this slide. It's basically just showing what our contractual obligations are in terms of health insurance and premium cost share by union. This is what we're obligated to do. So that's one of the drivers as well. As those premiums go up, our share of the health insurance contribution also goes up. And then finally, as we get to the end is, at the end of this process, just like any year, we get to a point where we, the Board of Ed, have to reconcile the numbers. We have a budget that's been built based on certain assumptions. There is a decision that's made, just like 2 years ago when it was 0%, just like last year when it was 4.5%. In any event, we get direction from you. This is what we're going to give you. And then we, board staff, we have to sit together and figure out where we are. Currently, where we are with the budget on our $245 million ask, locally funded budget, the mayor's recommended budget has us at 226, which is the 4%. And so as we move forward through this budget process, just as we've done in prior years, one of the things that we're looking at is, although the governor's budget is not complete, this process, our budget request came to you in December. The budget is ongoing. We anticipate, and I think I saw that on the city side, you were looking at possibly maybe $1 million. Possibly there's potential for about 1.6 additional grant funding that could come our way. And so one of the things that we would look to do, if that indeed materializes, is to offset some of these expenses on the local side towards the grant side. To your point, Ed, how are we supporting the local budget? The second area we're looking at is, if you recall last year when we came to you with a budget request, we had planned to do the South Norwalk School, and also we had received some unplanned costs for health insurance. And as we went through this budget, we had agreed that some of the carryover funds from last year we could apply to make up that difference. So what we're seeing this year in monitoring what those health insurance costs are, we feel like potentially we may not need to necessarily spend down that entire amount. There could be, we're still monitoring this, but potentially there may be about $2.5 million of what you approved last year in carryover for health insurance with some of the turnover we've had. the projections for health insurance this fiscal year could potentially come lower. The overhead expenses at the South Norwalk School have come slightly. I think we had budgeted 1.8 million for that school. With some of the staffing issues and the enrollment, we're maybe looking at 1.6, 1.7. So there's potentially that, and that's what we've set aside potentially in other funds outside of the current year's budget that we could come up with. That does leave us with a substantial deficit from where we started. So the way that we're approaching this as we move forward is to look at where are the areas that we obviously have to make reductions. So the way that we group our budget, when you see here the reductions to balance, we have basically 4 different buckets, which is the primary areas where the funds are spent: high school, middle school, elementary, and our non-school. So in looking at where these reductions can come from, when we talk about non-school, these are support services. This includes things like special education, curriculum, all of those things that are non-classroom related, but provide general support to schools. So these are the dollars amounts that we would necessarily need to come in terms of reductions. And again, this is a planning document, but this is roughly where those savings would have to, or those reductions would have to come from. So we're looking at about 2.6 million from the high schools. On a per pupil calculation, we estimate that reducing our per pupil by about 662, and that would get us to that 2.6 million. Then we would have to see, like, where are we going to make those reductions? Is it in staffing? Is it in programming? Is it in supplies and materials? So we will be sitting with the same way we've sat with them when we built this budget. We're going to go back to them and say, hey, this is all we have, and this is how we have to make these numbers work. And so we will be working with the Board of Education. Our hope is, as we go through this process, and we realize that the Common Council did add an additional $1 million in the cap. It's your prerogative where that $1 million is spent. If that is applied towards the Board of Ed, then that obviously changes some of these scenarios. As we go through this process, if you are able to identify some additional funding for the Board of Ed, that changes this. But we just kind of wanted to show you what the work remains on our end, depending on where we end with this process. This is kind of the things that we need to do to balance the budget and reconcile it as we do each year.
Yeah, so Linda, two
Yes,
questions related to this, if I may, right?
sure.
First, as I look at kind of the reductions you have here, I understand it, but it provokes a question on my part. You have roughly 2,000 FTEs in education today, 11,000 roughly students, so a 5-to-1 ratio of headcount to student. Do we know what that ratio looks like for other districts of our size and scope, similarity? Are we staffed appropriately per student when you compare it to other districts that are similar to ours?
So I'll answer it in 2 ways. One is, when we did the efficiency study several years ago, we had an independent team come in, and they did just that. Not only did they look at our staffing ratios within Connecticut, but they also looked at comparable ratios in other places. And one of the things that they did, which is what they're supposed to do, is not just look at an 11,600 district compared to an 11,600 district. They looked at the composition. They looked at the composition of the students, and that's what they did. I think they identified there was a district in, I believe somewhere in Rochester, that was comparable to us. And in their analysis, which you have, they said that we were actually in that particular ratio, we were on the lower end. So that's what I would say to that. Now, has there been another analysis done since the efficiency study? No, but the last third-party study that was done, basically those were the results that they gave us. They said that looking at our district and others, in terms of staffing ratios, where we are today, we were below the benchmark that they used.
And that staffing study, just for clarity on my part, that staffing study, or that efficiency study, excuse me, was done over 5 years ago, you think? I'm not going to hold you to a date, but.
No, I believe they presented it last summer. And the study was done about several months leading to last summer's presentation.
Okay, then I misunderstood that. Thank you.
We're talking about the city's efficiency study.
Okay. Well, then because then I misread the city's efficiency study, because it looked to me in that study as if we were on the high end of staffing. So I think we need to reconcile how we're all reading that report.
Sure.
Okay. The second question is more minor, and it's back to the prior page where you kind of talked about the healthcare and other contractual obligations. Is all of that data based on just current staff, or does that include plans for incremental staff within those numbers?
No, so the way that well, there's two ways, right? So the way that we look at staffing, we do a population count of current staffing, what the current staffing is and what the current election. So how many are single, how many are taking family, and so forth. So we take that population and then we multiply that by what we are projecting that the insurance cost is going to be. So we do that.
Okay.
And then for positions that are vacant, we actually use a conservative number, and we budget, historically, we've budgeted vacancies at family insurance plans. This year, we budgeted them at single, which is a
Okay.
risk, but we budgeted
Understood.
at single. And so that's kind of how we came up with those insurance calculations.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Luna, just a quick question. I thought with the new teacher's contract that was just negotiated during the summer, that we talked about health insurance savings of about possibly $3 million. Is that off the table now?
No, so what we did, and you'll see here, I have the health insurance in my chart. That's the first number up top. So, and you were right, because you were part of that conversation. So when the teachers union collectively bargained last year, one of the things that they had in the contract was for the Board of Ed to go out for an RFP to see if there's something better and cheaper than the current state plan that we're on. And so we commissioned Siegel, who is both the city and the Board of Ed advisor, to go out for an RFP to look at those, see what's out there. They received bids from four vendors, Cigna, Aetna, and then there were two others that came back. So what we're currently doing is reviewing what those potential savings are and what the plans and coverages are with our unions, with our employee base. And so if those numbers come out favorably, and if we see that there's a potential for us to transition to a plan that both saves the Board of Ed money and saves the employees money, we would have a number to plug in here. At this point, we're not at that point yet, but that is something that's ongoing. If you recall, Jim, in that negotiation, the challenge with the 2.0 plan is they take us all or nothing. Like, we can't parcel out. We can't say the teachers are in and everybody else is out, or vice versa. And so for this to make sense, all of our unions have to agree the way forward. We have to open up all the bargaining and renegotiate that particular piece. And then we will know whether there is a saving or not. We're actually in the analysis period now. And so if we do find that there is potential savings there, whatever that number ends up being, 3 million, 4 million, 1 million, that will change the calculation at the bottom of the sheet.
And do you have a timing? I'm not trying to hold you to something specific, but do we have a timing to complete that work, Linda?
I believe the way that the contract is in is July 1. Our goal is perhaps by April, end of April, we will have a decision or some direction in terms of where we are with that.
Okay.
Because there's some lead times that need to happen if we're transitioning. I believe we have to give the state like a 60-day notice that we're moving, 60 or 90-day notice.
Okay.
There's some system
But it
issues
would
we have to
impact this next year's budget.
It would, because it would be a July 1 if we were to move forward with it.
Yeah,
It would have,
and it'd be a
Right.
nice, it would be a nice chunk too.
depending on what the number ends up being, it could be.
Well, I mean, they were pretty, I think everybody was pretty confident that $3 million was a pretty good number, and that, you know, indeed, that was one of the things that helped us agree with setting the union number.
Yeah, I mean, so we'll see. I mean, I can't speculate on what the unions are going to bargain, but yes. And that's why I have the health savings with a placeholder.
I'm
because
trying
I
to
know
get some
that that's an item.
optimism out of you, Luna.
What was that?
I'm trying to get some optimism out of you.
No, I think that's fair, Linda. And again, that could be a big swing on both sides.
Could be.
So let's just stay close on that one, please.
Oh, so what you have that in at the current price, right?
What we have
Current
projected,
cost, I should say.
what we have projected now is what, staying on the 2.0 plan,
Right,
based on the
right.
2.0 plan. So if there's
Yeah,
any
right.
change to this, it would be an
Yeah,
offset.
okay.
Yeah.
Got
Okay,
Good.
thank you.
So I'm almost towards the end. Thanks for your patience. You did want to see a staffing trend. So I've included this staffing trend for you. I did highlight just for discussion purposes where the drivers have been over years. So you'll see, we were at 1,500 employees and we're at 1,900, and that's a big number. But the highlighted areas are where we have seen those incremental positions added over this period of time. And I think Mr. Pennington may be able to speak to this and others, but I think if you look at the teachers and the paraeducators, some of that has to do with these individual education plans and the supports that are needed. But these have been the increases and the drivers for these positions. You look at counselors and social workers over time, that's where those are. And then I mentioned at the transition of the staffing discussion, we did have these math improvement teachers and reading improvement teachers that were added in the past 2 years, and that's where those counts are. But you have this chart. You also have a detailed staffing charts by schools, by departments that complements this chart, but I did want to show this chart as part of this analysis because it was
Yeah,
something.
and again, just because it's highlighted and I don't remember it off the top of my head, the definition of non-affiliated staff.
Unaffiliated staff are individuals that are not necessarily in a union, collective bargaining union. And let me see if Rob is on the phone. Rob, are you still on? I got it.
I'm on.
Oh, okay. No, actually, no, maybe Kristen, if you're on, Kristen. I can get you the breakdown of what the
Yeah,
non-affiliated staff
I'm just
are.
curious
Yeah.
what defines it, right? Are
Sure.
those student facing? Are they?
So
back
some
office?
They're a
examples,
combination. Yeah.
I can
go ahead.
talk about that, Ed, if you want.
Thanks.
Some examples of what's in there are positions in finance, audiologists, BCBAs,
Okay.
myself, some other budget people, communications,
Got it.
human resources, because they're positions that cannot be in a union because there's a conflict of interest. So
Okay,
we
thank
do
you.
have a total listing by year, if, anyone's interested.
Not looking to get that crazy, just looking for the general definition of what was in that line item, and that helps. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kristen.
Okay.
Is there anything driving the 100% increase?
Say that again, Jim.
What's driving the 100% increase in that? We went from 44 in 2019 to 84 now.
We can give you the individual breakdown that Kristen talked about by position.
We have all the details by position.
I do have a question. Has there been any effort to target staff that is multilingual or could reduce the need for increased staffing for students with higher needs? Because it seems like that's the main driver of increased costs. Could, increased training have a compound effect on the teachers and maybe reduce costs moving forward?
I think that the staff that has been hired has provided a compounding effect of both, right? Provided opportunities for increased training for personnel, but we continue to need these interventionists because they provide very targeted and specific supports for students in the classroom and across the district.
But we have been attending, Kendrick, to your point, particularly the multi-language, bilingual teachers. We have the National Association of Bilingual Educators that has the annual conferences. We have actually been recruiting and set up recruiting booths at those. There was one held last year in New York City where we've sent people We have been actively recruiting in Puerto Rico and sent flyers out there and made partnership with universities. That is an ongoing effort. It is one of those shortage areas that we had talked about at the very beginning that is heavily hard to recruit.
And one of the things that I would say is that as a district, we also participate in an ARCTEL program that supports our current educators who would want to become bilingual certified to be able to take on some of these courses. So yes, we are doing a lot to recruit outside of Norwalk, but we're also working to build capacity of our own educators in that same regard.
Thank you.
Luna, in the book, do we have total dollars that would go with this head count?
You do. On
And I apologize, I just don't have my book.
No,
with me.
that's fine. It does begin on page 39. We group the staffing salaries by, so you have the principals, supervisors, teachers. So there is a separate line item for each of these over time.
So for example, if we take some of the larger increase, 20%, 22%, 20% increase in teachers, and if we have a flat head count, is there anything that's driving the increased teachers in that case? I mean, if we're not getting more students in, why do we need more teachers? And I don't mean to take away, I'm not looking to cut teachers. I'm just looking for explanations why it goes up. Please, anybody who's
think it's
watching,
what
I
we
don't
said
want to cut teachers.
So I think it's what we were articulating earlier, Jim, regarding the need and why we need to provide an updated chart that well represents the high needs population, because the reason why we've needed additional personnel is because the population of students that we're serving requires additional supports. And in some cases, require, as a result of it, we need to hire additional FTEs to provide those supports. So for instance, for multilingual learners, we need additional personnel to provide the language support that they need. For students receiving specialized services, depending on the learning model that their IEPs mandate, either like a co-teaching setting where you have two teachers in a classroom providing support, one which is a general ed teacher, the other which is a special education teacher. Those are just some examples of supports that we have to embed within our system that create the additional need for more teachers and staff.
Okay, so if I look at 2020, 21, 22, 22, 23, and then 23, 24, you're looking at modest increases in the number of teachers, which is different if I look back at 18, 19, 19, 20, where you have fairly significant jumps. So that's when the special ed really kind of kicked in. That's where we have COVID, where we've got more diverse teachers coming in to meet the needs that we have. Multilingual, you know, the demographics really haven't proved that out, but I hear what you're saying. Is that?
Yeah, and what you're saying is accurate. When we get the updated survey data in terms of the high needs population, that will give us a better indicator of where we are relative to where we used to be. We will share that with you. The challenge is that we're still in the process of collecting that data.
Mhm.
But although the overall enrollment numbers have not increased, the needs within that the population of students is very different than it was in the past. And as Mr. Pennington articulated in terms of the special education program development, as those programs continue to grow over time, which the presentation that we just forwarded to you will show, we need additional personnel to meet the needs of the students as they continue to grow in the system.
Yeah, one of the things also that you recall at the high schools, there were some years where we got a lot of feedback from parents when we had a lot of study halls that weren't, so part of this was addressing that particular challenge with the study halls and making sure, so that was all part of building that up. And so that was also one of the drivers to support that.
Yep. Okay.
So I'm almost to the end. You did ask a question about the carryover amounts. So I have here what those have been in each given year. As you know, all of these come to you every year, unlike other districts. Some districts where they interpret the statute differently, some districts just roll over their funds each year. Norwalk has always come to the BET with a listing of what the rollover dollars are and what the intended purposes are. So I did provide the historical numbers of what those are. The question was, what do you anticipate to roll over this year? And at this point, it's difficult to tell. We're running the forecast, as Mr. Pennington pointed out. We were budgeting $9.2 million in special education. We're projecting 10.2. So our Board of Finance, and Ms. Sherry here can speak to it, we've been doing these internal transfers to make up for the difference so that we're not coming to the city for special appropriation. So at this point, it's more difficult this year than most years to predict where we would end, because what we're really trying to do is absorb all of those incremental costs within the budget without having to come for special appropriation. And therefore, I can't say that we're going to have X numbers because it's such a moving target.
Yeah.
And then finally, we talked about, there's been conversation is, how does the Board of Ed, as an elected body, know how we're doing? How do they track performance? We go through this budget process. As Ms. Pritchett mentioned, you're involved kind of like towards the budgeting end, but the board is involved year round. And so here's a series of workshops that we do, and we present as staff to the Board of Education, and these are all public meetings. Each month, we spend deep dive into specific topics, our testing, our accountability, our budgets. We do mid-year updates on the strategic plan. And so this is just a listing of what we do to stay accountable and to keep our board informed. And then, like you, we have monthly finance committee meeting where we review the finances. Year to date, we discuss trends. And so for us, this is an ongoing process year round that really never ends. And then finally, just where can you get additional information? We have budget schedules in the book. This year, we created a designated website on the budget, on the Norwalk Public School website to really provide this information. And then obviously public hearings and budget meetings, we invite people. But one thing that we are really, really proud of this year is, in our efforts to be transparent and accountable, this year, the Norwalk Public School set out to receive this designation by the Association of School Business Officials. Is just to be more transparent. We have presented to you for the first time a fully transparent budget document similar to what you have on the city side. We talk about programs, we talk about the strategic plan, we all tie it together, and we were fortunate to receive this recognition from the Association of School Business Officials International, and this is the standard that we like to have moving forward. But we are really committed to providing information, answering questions to the best of our ability. And I am done with my presentation, and maybe there's still some
Can I
questions.
just have a few minutes?
Sure.
Sure, Dr. Estrada.
I'll wait for the questions first and then.
Yeah, I was going to ask before we get to kind of closing remarks, any additional questions from any of the Board of Estimate and Tax members?
Yeah, Ed, I have just a one follow-up question. Ed, Henry gave us a number on one of the earlier slides when he added in the in-kind services that the city is paying for, in addition to the numbers on the budget. Henry, right? And you came up with a number. It was about 29,000 per student. Is that the number? Am I saying that correctly?
Yes, I added in both the assigned services, which is 30,000, and the amount of money that the state pays for the teachers' pensions, which is another 30 million. So I took Lunda's all-in budget, not the 245, the 270 something.
287.
287, excuse me, added the 60, which gets to 347. And then I divided that by the head count that it was in Linda's budget book of 11,600, which was for fiscal year 24.
Yeah, thank you. And I was just wondering, Linda, you were in New Canaan, right? You were the CFO for a number of years there.
I was.
Could you do an apples to apples on that number for what it was for per kid in New Canaan? I'm just curious what that number would be.
Yes, so the number that Henry's quoting is actually reported statewide. It's part of the EFS report. So we report that number too. So it's not a budgetary number because each district reports the numbers differently. And so the way New Canaan, for example, does their in-kind is different than what we do. But the EFS report that's compiled by the state seeks to provide that normalcy. So what I can do, I can get the EFS report that we also compile, which includes those numbers, and do an apples to apples, not only for New Canaan, but I could look for Fairfield County, for example.
I figured because you were close to that. I was just curious what.
No,
that
off the top of my head, I don't know what that number is, that EFS number, but we can get you the EFS data as well.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
one thing I can say is that compared to our Fairfield County, we are most closely aligned to Stanford, but disproportionate to our surrounding towns, which are per pupil spending more than we are. We can provide that chart. We've done that in the past as well, and I think it's a good comparison to have. I actually was looking at that chart with my colleagues today, and it's depending on which town you're looking at $2,000 to $3,000 difference per pupil.
Yeah, I know the ESC, we're in a group of school systems that are similar to Norwalk. I'm just curious to see just what a number would be as a comparison. That's all.
Okay, so we'll make.
We can
sure-
run the EFS report. It's usually a year, because it's audited numbers. It may be 12 months old, but we can get the most recent numbers for comparative purposes.
Thank you, Linda. Additional
I think
questions?
it's best to compare, what is it, our DRG?
Yes,
Is that what it's called?
the district, yes.
Yeah,
the
so
DRG.
I think that's the most accurate comparison.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had one other question. Do you have any idea what is driving the increase of high need students? And, is there any way we can resolve or solve that problem to, improve in the future?
I think the drivers have been shortage area costs and how those things have increased over time. One of the things that as a collective superintendents, as well as like our local universities are talking about, is how do we continue to increase opportunities to have more students get into our the fields that are considered shortage areas right now, because a lot of the cost drivers are associated with not having enough people within the different pools where we have the highest ask for. And one of the things that we're doing is professionally developing within and looking for creative ways to continue to develop our personnel so that they can acquire additional certification that will allow them to do that. An example of that is for the TESOL license and the bilingual license. We have been collaborating with local partners to allow our teachers to get the certification that they need so that they can provide those services, and keeping that within the personnel that we currently have in our system is an example.
So the shortage areas are, I guess, anywhere where you need increased staffing to, combat those problems on the front end. What is a shortage area is what I'm getting at.
A shortage area is, for instance, a special education teacher, a bilingual teacher, any certification or educator that we might need in our system that is hard to staff because there's not many people out there for us to pick from, to put it simply. So our HR team is constantly trying to recruit, but there's not a big pool of these individuals in the field for us to choose from. So increasing the pool will help us have better options and have the ability to fill vacancies that are difficult to staff. I hope
Dr.
I
Estrella,
answered
does that also include science and math teachers as well?
It includes science, math. It also includes, I said special education, bilingual education, and dually certified people where you have a need for a math teacher that is bilingual certified or a special education teacher that is also math certified, for instance. Those are also difficult to staff areas because you need a person with 2 different certifications to fulfill the need of students, particularly in middle school and high school, where you need people that are content experts, but also have the ability to provide specialized services and interventions.
Additional questions?
Did that help?
Yeah, that helps.
Thank you, Kendra.
Any additional questions? Then, Dr. Estrella, before we close, you wanted to make some remarks?
Sure. First and foremost, I just wanted to thank the BET for always asking really good questions that helps us further reflect in the work that we're doing and just help inform the public and our practice. I just want to reiterate that we've spent an incredible amount of time within the system, looking at our strategic plan as well as the efficiency study to really inform the work that we do to move practices across the system. And we've made tremendous strides in addressing the needs of some of our most vulnerable population, but in general, all of our students. And we want to make sure that we continue to do that to ensure that Norwalk thrives, not only now, but in the future. Through the coaches, our interventionists, our library media specialists, our specialized personnel like our special ed teachers, our bilingual certified teachers, as well as our generalists, have played an incredible role in ensuring that our students continue to get a outstanding education despite the pandemic and many of the challenges we've had to face. And as the BET continues to consider alongside the mayor the path forward, I hope that it's taken into account the efforts that the educators across our system have put forward. Yes, costs are a challenge for everyone. Unfortunately, contractual obligations continue to increase, and it's something that is beyond our control other than when we negotiate being very cognizant of keeping costs low. In a budget that 85% encompasses the personnel that is in front of our children, it creates a situation where we have to make very difficult decisions because we don't want to minimize the services that we're providing in the classroom. And I hope that as you think about the budget and wherever possible, there's ways to increase the funding that has been allotted to the BOE, that is taken into consideration, because our children have gone through a lot and they deserve an opportunity to have an outstanding education. And I know that everybody here and everybody across the city is working really hard to try to do the best thing possible with limited resources. 4% is just not enough for us to fulfill our contractual obligations and needs. And I hope that there is room to do better so that we can most effectively support our students despite the difficult path forward that we have to face in terms of reducing personnel that we still find are critical and essential to do the essential work of educating our students. Again, thank you to you, to all of you and the mayor in listening to our needs, and I hope that this conversation and the additional information we provide help you make an informed decision that will benefit all the children of Norwalk.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, before I close, any comments?
Thank you, Mr. Abrams, and thank you, Dr. Estrella and your team. I don't think there's anybody that's more committed to education than the city of Norwalk, and we certainly appreciate the presentation by Mr. Osmani. I think my team and I have been working on a couple of creative ways that we may be able to move forward with a little bit more funding, but we're going to take a look at that. And it will not affect the MBR that we're all concerned about. So again, we looked at everything tonight. I think there was a good presentation. We understand the challenges. We have challenges in BOE just like everybody else. But one thing I've always prided myself in, as well as the city of Norwalk, is we have tried to fund everything we possibly can without overtaxing those who cannot afford to pay those taxes. So we will continue to move forward, do what we can, and work together with the Board of Education and Norwalk Public Schools to see how we can come to an agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
We'd
And-
appreciate that. Thank you.
And to all, on behalf of the Board of Estimate and Tax, I thank you. I thank you for having hard conversation when we needed to tonight. It's part of the process, right? The education is critically important. I don't think there's an individual who would ever disagree with that. It is simply striking the balance that we need across our full community. That is our charge and our challenge, and we'll work together to solve for that. But it requires hard conversation like we had tonight. So I thank you for that. For any members of the public who listened in on this call, I will remind you all that your voice is important too. And there is a Board of Estimate and Tax public hearing scheduled for March 22nd at 6:30 p.m. at which you can express any point of view that you have on this topic as well, because this is also requires that point of view from everybody. So with that, again, on behalf of the Board of Estimate and Tax, thank you for the frank and honest conversation. Thank you for the detailed presentation. We've got a few follow-up items we agreed to. Tom and I and Linda will make sure that we've all got the right to-do list coming out of this meeting. And we'll keep grinding through the process. With that, thank you all very much and have a nice evening.
You too. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Night all.
We already sent you some of the documents.
Thank
Perfect.
you.